start the stream, or like at least start talking. Okay. Oh, here we go. Great. So really good start there. I've started the stream by talking about how I don't know how to start the stream. Cool. Hello everyone. How are you all doing today? Hello Jake, hello Rosie in chat. So today we are doing another panel. This is our third time doing it. And our aim with these is to highlight specific issues and topics surrounding mental health and mental ill health that maybe aren't talked about so much. And we'll speak to people with lived experiences of those things to gain a little bit of insight, maybe give a little bit of advice, and basically do some learning. So today we are doing a panel on chronic illness and disability. And we'll be looking at some insights into how that affects people day to day, and then some of the more specific challenges and different things that are involved with people who are chronically ill, have chronic pain, are disabled or multiply disabled, etc. I'm Sky. I work for Safe in Our World, as a lot of you probably know. And today we are joined by Shawnee. Hello.
Hello.
How's it going? You good?
Yeah, it's going pretty good.
Excellent. Did you want to just, as we go around, give a little tiny intro about yourself, you know, who you are, what you do, kind of thing?
Yeah, so I am Shawnee. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a community manager for a game studio called Bonsai Collective, and I stream part-time as well on Twitch.
Awesome, thank you. And we also have Paige with us. Hi.
Hello. So quickly.
Yeah, what do you got going on?
So yeah, I'm Paige, or Pan. You might see me referred to as either. I'm the gaming community manager for a charity in the UK called Special Effect, who work with physically disabled gamers to make sure they have access to games, which is very near and dear to my heart as a disabled gamer. I used to stream full-time on Twitch. I would say I stream part-time. I stream very infrequently, normally when the mood takes me with music or advocacy work. But yeah, you may find me on Twitch as Pandemonium.
Excellent, thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, we have Lee. Hi, how are you doing today?
Hi, yeah, I'm good. Yeah, intro. Right, I'm Lee. As you can probably see in the lovely summer along here pronouns, I'm they, them, non-binary, and I'm a QA tester at a studio called the Chinese Room. I'm also a Women in Games ambassador, and I also like to yell about accessibility a lot, which generally is just what I do. You know, I just go out into the street and yell about accessibility. Yeah, I also haven't for a while, but I did used to stream a bit. I used to do VTubing, which was a lot of fun.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, and I've just big into game stuff, which is, but that's me.
That's awesome. I mean, and luckily that's also what we're here to yell about and talk about today. So that is perfect. Oh, Jake says in chat, I spilt vegetable oil all over the kitchen. Oh no.
Yeah, that's gonna be fun.
To a good start. Okay, cool. So what we'll do now is we'll jump into a few questions so we can learn a little bit more about our panelists and cover a few topics. But if anyone in chat has a specific question that they would like to ask, feel free to pop it in chat. We will try and get to it. But please make sure that when you are chatting and asking questions, that they are appropriate. Any kind of inappropriate comment, hate speech, etc., will not be tolerated. I will just ban you. So with that said, we'll pop into the questions. Now, what I'll do is I'll try and start with a different person each time, so we have a little bit of variety in who goes first. But for this one, Paige, I'll ask you first. Can you just tell me a little bit about your chronic illness? So how long have you been chronically ill or disabled? And then a little bit of how that impacts you day to day.
Oh, so this is the big question where
Yeah, it's a loaded
I have
one.
ADHD. It's all right. ADHD causes problems here for remembering everything. I was initially diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis, which comes with what's called skin presentation of psoriasis. So I have atypical. So normally if you have somebody with psoriasis, they'll have like raised plaques on their skin where the skin grows too fast and it cracks and things. Mine goes the other way, where some of my skin's incredibly weak and splits and bleeds and gets infected very easily, which is a real problem. So I was diagnosed with that when I was 19. Then about 5 years later, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is a lot of research has been coming out recently. We're understanding where it comes from. So it has this sort of stigma of being the thing you get diagnosed with when they don't know what to diagnose you with, but there are actually diagnostic criteria for it. Most of my illnesses come under what's called autoimmune. So my body attacks itself. It sees itself as the enemy, as you would if you had like a cold, a flu, a virus, and it goes after itself. So essentially, if I do anything that causes my body to feel threatened, whether that's exercise, daily activity, cleaning, working, sleeping sometimes, my body will start attacking the joints that we use to do those activities. Essentially, what that means day to day is that I have to be very careful and understand where my limits are. So I couldn't just go and clean my entire kitchen, because if I stretch my shoulder too much, my body will start attacking that shoulder and can cause swelling, it can cause pain, it can then essentially cause pain to go across to my ribs and my chest. It makes things very difficult, and it is very frustrating to learn to get on with, because all those things you could do, suddenly you can't do because your body anticipates that you are the enemy, which is a real annoyance. Managing it is also quite difficult. It's taken me 10 years to get onto some decent medications to actually try managing it after some pretty bad reactions to previous medications. I work 4 days a week instead of 5 to allow myself time to actually have medications and rest. So just this morning, I've been started on a new medication, which I'm on my second dose, which is called adalimumab, which is a ridiculous name, but it is an injectable medication that you inject into your stomach or thighs, which essentially dampens your immune system so it gets confused and doesn't attack you as often. But that does mean it doesn't fight off anything else. So if I caught COVID, for example, I would be at a much higher risk because my body would now no longer have any idea how to fight. The impact day to day is that everything is different, and it does dictate every action, and it does dictate freedom and safety, and it is frustrating, but it has had its upsides in allowing me to better prioritize rest and realize that humans aren't meant to just made to work all day and then sleep all night and work all the next day and sleep again. So although it's come at a cost, it has made me more appreciative for actually getting to enjoy my time.
Thank you. I think that the way that you explained how that works in terms of your body trying to, like fight itself, is a really good way of explaining it, and hopefully that makes the concept easier for some people to grasp who maybe didn't have a huge understanding of it. And you raised some really good points there about how just day-to-day stuff is a lot more challenging or requires a lot more thought. Like, it's not just, oh, I'll pop down and clean the kitchen. You have to think about how that's going to impact you, and really plan it into your day, which is not something that a lot of able-bodied people might have to do in terms of that planning element. So thank you very much for raising that. Lee, would you like to talk to us next about your illnesses, disabilities, and how they affect you day to day? Oh, you're
I think
muted,
you're
sorry.
muted, Lee.
That's me trying to be polite and make sure I'm unmuted, and then like being like I can't touch anything else because everything's gonna break. So my bad. Yeah. So much like Pan, I also have fibromyalgia. So very much similar situation with that. I also have ME/CFS, which is so these are two conditions. When you have them together, they're very difficult on their own, and then when they're together, it's like, oh my god, this is hellish. For me, I tend to have a sort of like a short form version of it, because so many times in my life I've had to explain to people like what it means. You say it and they're like, what's that? And I'm like, here we go again. Basically, with my ME and CFS, I'm exhausted all the time. I cannot have restful sleep. So when I sleep, no matter how long or how short, I don't wake up feeling rested at all. I basically wake, like, imagine if you go to bed and you wake up with like a hangover after like the heaviest night of your life. That's just how I feel generally. Like everything is so much, noises are louder, my brain feels foggy, it's just a lot at once. My fibro is very much the same. It shares a lot of symptoms with ME. It has a lot of this brain fog. Things are exhausting, but it also involves my body being in pain all the time. I basically am in a constant state of pain, which sounds more terrifying than it is, but it's not. It is terrifying, but when you're living with it, you're like, wow, that sounds really dramatic, but it actually is true. Like there's a constant state of pain. And having both of these conditions together, which I believe is called having comorbid conditions, is quite a difficult process because you're sort of like, I'm in so much pain, I need to rest. And then you're like, I'm resting and I don't feel any better. I just feel tired. And it's just kind of like you're at a constant war inside your own body. With day-to-day stuff, as you can imagine, this is like, it's very difficult to do anything. It's sort of like, there's a lot of things like before I got sick that I could do. I was very outdoorsy. I like to go hiking. I like to walk a lot. And I cannot do any of this at all. With both the conditions, I have mobility issues. I use a walking stick to help me get around. I cannot walk for very long. I am that person who's constantly like, I'm sitting down. I see a bench, I'm sat there, you know, and I'm there for like 15, 20 minutes and I'm like, yeah, let's go. And all I'm doing is thinking about the next bench I'm going to find because I need to sit down again. And it just, it makes your life change a lot. But similarly, it does make you sort of reassess how life is. I've also had that same sort of mindset of like, you realize that you're not meant to be constantly working all the time or putting yourself through all this stress, and that it is okay to sort of slow down and take a break. And I think although there's all these like really terrible things that come with, you know, having a chronic illness, it's incredibly difficult. And every single person I've ever met with a chronic illness, I'm immediately like, I know, even if I don't have the same condition, I know that your life is so much more difficult than, you know, an able-bodied person. I know that there's also this sort of side to it where having that ability to slow down your life and pace it differently also gives you a different perspective on life. Sort of accepting it also leads you to be like, you know what, it's okay. I can take a break. I can enjoy things that maybe I didn't enjoy before because I was at a much faster pace. But yeah, it's very much affects everything. And I think I'd be here all day if I was explaining how, you know, how many things it affects. But it's exhausting, I think, is a very good word for it all. But that's how it affects me.
Yeah, definitely. I think that exhausting is a good summary for that. But thank you as well for highlighting some of the ways that being chronically ill has changed your mindset. Because, and this is me speaking as someone who isn't chronically ill or disabled, so as an able-bodied person, I think a lot of people will often not look at it with pity necessarily, but they'll hone in on the more challenging aspects of being ill or disabled. And from having spoken to people in my life who are disabled or chronically ill, having that sort of mindset, or that being the only thing that's ever talked about, can be in itself quite tiring, for it to always be like, oh, like, that's so terrible, everything you have to go through is so bad. And like, obviously it is really bad and we really want to draw attention to that. But it's good that we're able to, you know, highlight some of the ways that it can change your perspective. And I think what you and Paige have both mentioned about being more flexible with working is something that I'd really like to get into a little bit more with some of the other questions we've got coming up. But that, I think, is a really good way that employers can be more mindful and more accommodating of people who have, you know, like adjustments in the workplace that are needed. And there is just an element of, as you mentioned, when you're walking, you're always thinking about the next bench. Like, there is a need to recover where able-bodied people would not have the same need to recover. So having an extra day off or more frequent breaks, or, you know, even taking your existing break and having it in like different bursts instead of all at once, so that you can break up like the normal activities, is really helpful and has helped people in my life who have various conditions and disabilities. And then that brings us to Shawnee. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your conditions and disabilities and how they impact your life daily?
Yeah, so I've been suffering since I was 12. But I was not given a diagnosis until I was 19. So I have been diagnosed with also part of the fibrocure. I also have a small fiber peripheral neuropathy, which basically just means that the signals between my brain and my nerves get kind of jumbled up. So I will get signals for things that don't exist. So I will get times where, like, my hands, my arms, my legs just feel like they have really bad sunburn and things like that. It mostly just causes a lot of pain. It does have the upside of it makes sharp things tickle for me, which means tattoos are a painless experience, funnily enough. But sometimes even just putting like a jumper on, it like brushing against my arms can be agony. I also have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which it's a connective tissue disorder. So it kind of messes with the collagen that's in like your skin, your tendons, your ligaments, your muscles. And in simplest terms, it basically means that my joints are held together with bubble gum. So they will dislocate constantly. I wake up in the morning and it's like putting myself back together like Lego, just like popping everything back into place. I've got asthma and the very fun experience of long COVID. I caught COVID in November last year. I've been ill ever since with it. And on top of that, I am also part of like the depression and anxiety crew. I've got combined type ADHD, which was diagnosed this year. So it's a new diagnosis for something that I've kind of dealt with my entire life without realizing. And I have borderline personality disorder, which is very much misunderstood. It's kind of comes into the late diagnosis of stuff and just the trauma caused by dealing with that and trying to figure it out alone as a kid. I have complex PTSD because of it and because of some other stuff. And I'm currently going through the process for an autism diagnosis and suspected Crohn's disease. I am pretty much like an open book when it comes to talking about my disabilities, my chronic illness, because I went so long not knowing that there was something wrong with me because doctors didn't think there was anything wrong with me, that I feel like if I talk about it and someone goes, "Oh, like I kind of deal with that, like maybe I should see a doctor about it." But I take my medication. I get infusions. I basically get lidocaine infusions, which is a local anesthetic, and it just dampens the signal from my brain to my nerves, so that it doesn't completely get rid of it, but it calms it down and it makes it easier to manage. And I think because for I think all of us, our conditions aren't curable, so it's finding the ways to manage them so that we can have a good quality of life, which is something we deserve. And one of the daily impacts that a lot of able-bodied people don't think about is being disabled, being chronically ill is expensive. There are costs that we have to deal with that able-bodied people won't even think about. Our mobility aids aren't always covered. We don't always get them through the NHS, or if we do, there's a waiting list of years to see a specialist to get them. If you're like me and you struggle with like cooking, because it's dangerous for me to cook on my own, because if I'm moving like hot trays, hot pots, and my shoulder dislocates, then I'm going to burn myself. Then you have the added cost of getting proper nutrition that you can't make yourself, so it's more expensive. You're paying someone else to make it for you. Or even just getting like pre-prepared fruit and vegetable. Able-bodied people might look at that and go, well, that's lazy. Like, why are you paying that much more? But I can't use the knife all the time. I can't cut things up safely on my own a lot of the time. So all of these things that are made for, convenience, that they make more expensive because you're paying for the convenience. They're things that disabled, chronically ill people we need. So it's a lot more expensive. And I think that's one of like the hidden costs behind disability and chronic illness, is that they don't, like, able-bodied people don't realize how much more we have to pay. Even seeing specialists, I know a lot of people that have had to go private because waiting lists are 5-6 years, because there aren't enough specialists and there's more people realizing that they're disabled and chronically ill.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And wow, okay, so sorry, there was a lot there, so I'm just trying to like remember what I wanted to say. But so, I mean, firstly, thank you for sharing some examples of your experiences. I think that, as all of you have done, that kind of highlights those things that a lot of able-bodied people won't think about. Like, as you mentioned with the cooking, these are things that, that is every single day for you. And for a lot of us, maybe people watching this panel, this is the only time we're really going to think about that and then carry on with our lives like as we normally would. But it is important to remember that when it comes to disability and chronic illness, it is, generally speaking, a lifetime thing. And it's not something that, just goes away after you're done talking about it. So thank you for raising that. And I also just wanted to highlight something really interesting I noticed when actually all three of you were speaking, is you each kind of had like a really good analogy, like Shawnee, you were saying about the Lego thing, for how to explain how it feels. And I think it's really interesting that each of you, came up with a different one. Kind of, I imagine that probably came about organically from trying to explain it to people, and trying to find the best way to explain it to people. But thank you all for using those analogies and trying to illustrate it a little bit better, because it is difficult for people to understand when it's not something that they've experienced or even maybe come into kind of contact with through friends and family and that kind of thing. Yeah, so thank you very much for that. And thank you, Paige, as well, because I know that you've been popping the names of the conditions that we're discussing in chat, so that people can Google them or look them up later. And we'll also include those in the description of the video when we upload it onto YouTube, so people are aware and can take the words that you've spelled very well. I'm actually very impressed. And yeah, do a little bit more research on them should they wish to. Now, I'm going to read a couple of comments that we've had in chat. And I'm apologizing in advance for pronouncing everyone's name incorrectly, as always. But we've got one from Iliostomy Bag. I think one of the hardest parts of being chronically unwell is the invisible side of it. If I received a quid every time someone said to me, "Oh, well, you look fine," or "You don't look sick," when telling them about my chronic illness, I would be a very rich individual. I think that alone, despite the actual illness, can be very emotionally draining. I think that alone, despite the actual illness, can be very emotionally draining and damaging, because it's not just random people, it also comes from medical healthcare professionals. Now, I think that Shawnee, you were saying about the fact that it took you a very, very long time and a lot of effort to get diagnosed with stuff. Would you all say that that's kind of been your experience and that it was difficult to be believed by healthcare professionals, I guess? Feel free to chime in.
I will say that I definitely agree. When I got diagnosed with ME, and I will state the reason I don't use the full names because I never pronounce it right and I can never spell it right.
Absolutely valid.
It's so long. When I got diagnosed, that it was, and very similarly to fibro, it's very much a case of getting diagnosed with ME/CFS is like, we don't know what's wrong with you. Like we have done every test we've got or every test we're prepared to do. So this is what you've got. And it's a bit ridiculous because there are ways to actually test for it, but inevitably they do and they diagnose. But it was a constant struggle of like, so I'm sick, something's wrong with me, and the doctor being like, but your tests are clear. And I'm like, well, do more tests. And they do more tests. Your tests are clear, you're fine. And every single time it would be like, I'd call up, I'd be like, I've had my test. What was the result? You're clear. And that's it. They would not pursue further. Their mindset was not, all right, your test came back negative, so we need to keep looking. It was, your test came back negative, that's it. Like, what more do you want from us? And it is a constant struggle where you have to fight and constantly convince people, I'm sick. The doctor doesn't believe me. The second doctor doesn't believe me, until inevitably you find somebody who is like, I believe you, and oh my god, you have this, I can't believe. And it's I don't know about everybody else, but I've always had this experience of, it's always one person who's like, I can't believe you've gone through all this, it's so obvious that you have this, and you're just sat there like, you're just wanting to cry, like, yeah, I know, I've been doing it for years, like, I understand. And it was very similar for me with fibro, because I got diagnosed with ME several years before I got diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And it was a case of, again, okay, I accept this diagnosis. I've learned about the condition. Yes, it makes sense. I accept that. But also, this is not all that's wrong with me. There is another problem that is not covered by this. And you start the cycle again. And in that case, it started becoming, we've already diagnosed you with something. Why do you keep pushing it? And you start feeling a sort of, I feel like you start to question yourself, and you're like, well, am I crazy? Like, is there something wrong with me that I'm not okay with this, or that, is it all in my head? And I think that's a massive issue with it, is that when you are, especially with medical professionals, trying to convince people you're unwell, it makes you doubt yourself. And I think for a lot of people, it also makes them stop pursuing it, because they do get into that mindset of being like, maybe it's just me, maybe there isn't something wrong with me and it's in my head. And it's ridiculous, because that's not how the system should be. The system should be encouraging you to find out what's wrong with you. But because you're in this constant state of having to convince people, it's like, it leaves you in a position where you're just sort of like, you feel awful. Your mental health takes a massive dip, because you're just in this constant struggle of, am I actually sick? And I will say 9 times out of 10, if you feel symptoms and you're unwell, things, yes, you are, and you need to pursue it. And it's so heartbreaking that we have, as individuals, have to go up to doctors and tell them how to do the job and be like, test me, I'm unwell. You keep saying I'm fine and I'm not. So it does resonate with me an awful lot.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And hopefully that is something that a lot of viewers or members of the community can resonate with somewhat, because we've had a lot of stories. We've spoken to a lot of people about getting diagnoses for mental health conditions, and that can be equally challenging, and having to not necessarily have sort of tests and things like that in the same sense, but having to go back, having to follow up, having to chase, having to potentially try different medications and things like that. And yeah, thank you. And Shawnee, I'm not sure if you had something that you wanted to say on that fact. I wasn't sure if I saw you aiming to chime in a minute ago.
Yeah, so it's I had a very similar experience, and do you know the TikTok sound that's like, am I the drama? Because that is what plays in my head every time a doctor says, well, your tests are fine, so there's nothing wrong. And I have spent so much time thinking, like, is it actually there's nothing wrong with me and I'm just like imagining it? But then I remember that I'm having physical symptoms and I got sent to the hospital for a test because we were worried about Crohn's disease. I had the test and it was administered by the person at the hospital that is like the senior person for dealing with those cases. And afterwards, she said to me, if it's Crohn's you're worried about, this is not the right test for that. You need to go back to your doctor and ask for either this or this because nothing else is going to show it up. So they sent me for the wrong test. I went back to my doctor and I said, my test was clear, but they also said that you sent me for the wrong test for this. And they suggested that I ask for either this or this to be done. And my doctor just went, we'll just run some blood tests. So if they run blood tests for Crohn's for me, they're looking for inflammatory markers. I have chronic illnesses that cause inflammation. The markers are there regardless. That test is not useful for me. And, even for mental health conditions, I went to the doctor because I was struggling and I wasn't even referred to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. They just shoved me on some tablets. And, I didn't get to see a therapist until about 3 years later. And, I got to see my therapist for a year. And then they were like, okay, well, your allotted time is up. Like, we haven't fixed anything, but we're done. And, I spent 3 years trying to get a doctor just to refer me for an ADHD diagnosis. I got my diagnosis in January. I had a 90-minute appointment with a psychiatrist who at the end told me I could tell you had ADHD in the first 15 minutes of talking to you. And it was so obvious to the experts, but it's GPs just deciding that it can't be that, so we're not going to refer you for it. And it's such a frustrating cycle because I'm going through the exact same thing for an autism diagnosis now because I'm on ADHD medication now, which has suppressed the ADHD. And now we're realizing that, oh, well, your ADHD was like masking, but also managing your autism. And now it's really obvious. And it's the same cycle.
Yeah. And I can tell just from sort of how you've both been speaking about it that it is exhausting and frustrating. And, you're right to sound exasperated. And, although I mentioned that I don't have any chronic illness myself, like my dad has recently been diagnosed with primary progressive multiple sclerosis. Should have stuck with MS, like Lee was saying, but it was like grueling to get the diagnosis and to sort of put the puzzle pieces together, I guess. And another friend that I have who is multiply disabled has been through similar things where there are some things that still don't have a proper diagnosis, and the things that do, you go through so much, and then some of the medication that you get when they think it's one thing has such a horrible impact on your body. It's really not the right thing for you. It's some really, I guess, like heavy medications with a lot of side effects, and just that whole process, like on your body and your mind, is extremely draining. Before I read any more of chat, Paige, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. So I can only really speak about my sort of experience with medication and healthcare in the UK, but GPs in the UK are not traditional diagnosticians, which the NHS in the UK is not healthcare in the way you would expect. It is not preventative, and it is not in trying to preserve someone's health. The NHS, unfortunately, at this point in time, exists to fix. And when they can't fix easily, you slip through the cracks, which is where you find disabled and chronically ill people usually, until you find that one golden egg, that one person that will look at you as a person and all of the things you've brought them and find the answer. Now, if you've watched anything like Grey's Anatomy or House MD, you're going to see diagnosticians who go, oh, they have something wrong with their stomach, but they also presented with a bruise on their ankle and soreness in their shoulder. That means it's lupus. And it's the correct answer. And no, it's not that easy. But somebody in chat was saying, just Callie was saying that they suspect that their girlfriend has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. A friend of mine has recently gone through something very similar where I, being ADHD and having an absolute obsession with medication and healthcare and diagnostics, when she was telling me about some of her experiences over the last 10 years, there was a checklist in my head and I went, joint issues, stretch marks, soft skin, issues with stomach, which looks like gastroparesis. Interesting. That's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Guess what she just got diagnosed with? But it's been 10 to 15 years of suffering where a doctor never looked at all of the notes together to figure out what was wrong. It was just treating each individual symptom. And when you treat a symptom, it doesn't make it go away. It often makes other things worse. So I'm on pain medication to treat the issues with my spine, which causes issues with my bowels. There isn't a fix. And unfortunately, the best advice I can give somebody that's trying to seek a diagnosis is be your own best advocate. Unfortunately, you cannot rely on doctors in the current circumstance to find the answer for you, which really sucks. And it does mean that you're going to feel like a bit of an asshat sometimes going in and telling a doctor what they need to do for you, because it should be their understanding. But although there are a lot of very good doctors, they don't have your 20 plus years of experience. They have a few hours of learning about a specific illness. And that might have been 5 years ago. And they might not know about the most recent medications or the most recent treatments or the most recent understanding of that illness. And so if you're thinking, I feel like something is wrong with me, make notes, make a lot of notes. Even if you're like, my stomach hurts and it feels weird, but I've not eaten anything different, make notes of that, because it might be that something else in your body is causing you to have an inflammation reaction and that's causing issues with your stomach. You do have to, unfortunately, start diagnosing yourself, which is why self-diagnosis is so valid. But then you do need to take that to a doctor and you do need to say, now help me get the official diagnosis so you can start getting treated for it. It is difficult, it is long, and it is tiring, but you understand yourself the best, and you are the person that's going to be able to say, I know what's wrong with me, I've put these things together, now help me prove it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, especially about keeping notes so that you are coming with evidence. And it's frustrating because, as I've said with a lot of things in this job so far, and a lot of the conditions that we've talked about, when you are the least equipped to do so is when you have to put in the most effort sometimes. And that can, it can be extremely frustrating. But yeah, hopefully some of the insights that you've given might help people in seeking their diagnosis. I know that there's been quite a lot of people in chat mentioning that, they are in the process of seeking a diagnosis, or they are in the process of trying to get a doctor to take them seriously. And I think as well, one of the things that you mentioned, Paige, about how a diagnosis took, 10 years. Shawnee, your diagnosis took years and years as well. And that, if you think of what happens in your life in 10 years, I moved 5 times in 10 years. So that's, 5 different sets of GP surgeries that potentially has you starting all over again, or at least facing the same roadblocks of being taken seriously. Which is just, it's like you're peeling an onion, and there's just as soon as you get past one barrier, there's another one, and that, as soon as you unpick one thing to consider, there's more and there's more and there's more. Yeah, thank you. And just scanning through chat, because I know that there's a lot of conversation happening there. Thank you, Renji, for raiding and also for sharing your experience as well. I am sorry that it's exhausting and it's taken a long time to get someone to listen to you. But I'm glad that you have found that now. And welcome to everyone who's just started watching and listening now. So I guess the next thing that I wanted to talk about was challenges in the workplace specifically. Now, this is something that means a lot to me because I have worked with my best friend who's multiply disabled. So I have had experience and I've seen some of the workplace challenges and sort of in part shared in the extreme frustrations of that, and as it relates to my dad as well. I've seen how there can just be a lot of challenges that workplaces bring up, and even those that are, you know, sort of like quote unquote disability confident, that a lot of places just don't know what to do and aren't willing to be flexible when it's oftentimes something that requires a huge amount of flexibility. So yeah, my next question really is, can you tell us a little bit about what challenges you faced in the workplace as a result of your illness or disability? And Lee, we'll go with you first for this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so for me, and forgive me because I had to write notes for this because my brain cannot keep information all the time. I had two major points about this because I work in a game studio, so there's a lot of people that I have to sort of talk to on a daily basis. Now, with my conditions, I am considered a flexible worker, so I will work from home most of the time, but I can go into the office. I do tend to work from home more often than not because going into the office, I get wiped. You know, I do one day in that office and then I'm like 2 weeks, I have to work from home and it's not even like by choice. It's like I will wake up the next day, I have no energy, I'm exhausted. It's like I literally, like my bed's there. I roll from there into this chair to start my day. And as a result, from working from home, one of the things I kind of found, and I still find a bit of a barrier, and I don't think it's exclusive to where I work, I think it's a general industry problem, is the sort of communication between the teams within a studio and working from home can be a little bit broken. There can be a sort of difficulty between, you know, there'll be people who have office meetings and they'll be all in person together, they'll be sharing information and you might not be getting that information when you're at home, and it's not always done on purpose. It's not people being like, oh, we're going to keep information to ourselves. It's just a mindset of people don't think about the person working from home, and 9 times out of 10 that person working from home is disabled. You know, they're working from home for a reason. And I think for a lot of us, like, work from home is a really tremendous thing, because if, you know, for me, I wouldn't have this job if I couldn't work from home. Like, I could not go into an office every day. I didn't have a job for a very long time because I couldn't work from home. And it was actually weirdly the only good thing that came out of lockdown was so many companies suddenly being like, oh, we've suddenly realized that you could work from home, which is very funny because you start thinking you could have done this all along. But one of the biggest issues, you know, that I found is that you sort of had this breakdown where people aren't thinking about the person behind the screen. They're thinking about the people who's in their environment immediately. So if they relay some information to each other, that's it for them. They don't suddenly then think, oh, I better make sure this information is also relayed. And I think that that's sort of like a training issue that, and this is not just game dev. This is all offices. This is all sorts of like work environments. We need to start telling people that they need to start being more considerate of the people who aren't immediately there for whatever reason, because they're not getting the information. And I also find that there's like a huge amount of FOMO from that as well, because it's not just work related. It could be things that people talk about casually, and then you hear about something and you're like, I have absolutely no idea what these people are talking about, but I feel very out of the loop. And also social events is another big one for me. You know, in my office, they do tons of social events in person. We don't have an awful lot that's done online. I'm trying to change that because I'm very much like, there's so many work from home people, we need to like talk to each other. But again, it's not something that's at the forethought for a lot of people. They don't think about the people who aren't immediately there in person. And that in itself is ableism, because, you know, they're taking this and going, I'm here, I can have fun, I can go have drinks or do whatever with somebody. And you're like, okay, but what about all these people who can't do that for whatever reason, who are in their rooms or in their offices at home because they have a mobility issue, because they can't have the energy, but they, you know, we're humans. We still want to talk to each other. We still want to have, whether it's a work relationship or even just making friends at work, there's this massive barrier because people aren't considering, you know, making that effort to have events online, making that effort to sort of communicate online. And it's baffling to me, because if lockdown taught us anything, it is that so much can be done online, and it doesn't have to just be like meetings. You know, you can play games with people online, you can have movie nights with people online, you can have team building things done online. And I just feel like the consideration for people who work from home is not there. And like I said, it's not specific to game dev, that's all work environments, but it's definitely something that sort of needs to be worked upon. And besides that, the only other issue is that I don't know if anybody else has felt this. When I go in, it's not, when I started, it was not immediately the most accessible place. And I wanted it to be accessible. And at first, my anxiety was through the roof asking for anything. You know, it was like, I just got this job, I'm happy. I had been out of, in my previous job, I'd been out of work before that for a while. So working from home was a new thing. Working in an office is a new thing. So immediately having to be like, this is great, I need you to make these changes for me because I can't walk up your stairs. You know, I need you to give me disabled access. And then suddenly being like, can I ask for this? I don't want to cause a fuss. And you start panicking. You're like, I mean, I know, like I say, I'm not going to get fired for making a request for an adjustment, but sometimes your anxiety gets the better of you. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to rock the boat. Maybe they're going to start thinking that I am a troublemaker or something just because I'm asking for a reasonable adjustment. You know, like for me, it was simple as being like, I need a bigger chair because the chairs they had were not suitable for me. And I was so panicked at first. It was fine. But, you know, at first, the anxiety I had, and I think that in itself sort of stems from this trauma that a lot of disabled people have about just asking for what they require, asking for what they need, because a lot of us are made to feel like we don't deserve it. We do. We deserve so much. We deserve everything. But so much of our lives and our experiences, and I think this is interesting to say out loud, because we all have different problems. You know, we're all, or those of us that are disabled, and whether it's physical or not, I feel like the universal thing is that at some point in our lives, we've been made to feel like we're an inconvenience because of our disability. And even in a workplace, it's like you panic the minute you need something different from somebody else because you don't want to feel like, you know, there are people who might complain about being special treatment. You might have had experience of somebody complaining about it. And then when you're in an environment where it's absolutely fine, you also get that anxiety of like, oh my God, they're doing it. They're listening to me. When's this going to stop? You know, when are they, you know, when is the catch going to kick in where they're like, oh no, you've asked for too many adjustments. And I just think that there's like a lot of sort of a mixed trauma and a lot of anxiety. And for me, that's something I've had. I'm much better now. I definitely get a lot of stuff that I need, and I do it for other people in my workplace as I've sort of stepped up as an advocate to make sure that other people who need requirements, who have that anxiety, I just go, come to me because I've now done it. I know nobody's going to bite our heads off. But I know a lot of people have that in a work environment. They just panic that they're going to be too much. I will say nobody's too much, and you deserve everything.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point, and it's something that it looks like people in chat really resonate with. I mean, Fox Rocket mentioned about sort of the FOMO and the fact that as someone who's disabled, it might be necessary to work from home, that it can also feel like it's your fault for not being able to go in, and there can be a lot of guilt associated with that. And I think, you know, in my experience as well, when I've previously had hybrid working situations, there's also this kind of, from the people who aren't working at home, there's almost a sort of a jealousy or an assumption that the person who is working at home is lazy. And and they're just doing it because they can't be bothered to come into the office, rather than they physically cannot, or if they physically could, there would be XYZ ramifications, and then you'd be saying they were lazy for needing time to recover from coming into the office.
Yeah.
And it just goes on. And what you said about needing the equipment really, really resonates with me, because, and my friend has spoken about this, so I'm sure she won't mind me mentioning it. But in the previous workplace where we were, she needed specific equipment to accommodate her disabilities. A chair, like a special mouse that looks like a joystick, like all that kind of stuff to change the direction of her hand, whatever. And it took 7 months to get that equipment. And every single day for all those 7 months, she's in more and more pain, because it's not like, as you said, you needed a bigger chair. She didn't need a different chair because she just wanted to be comfy, or like that was
Yeah.
her preference. She needed a different chair because it was going to alleviate her pain from her disability, or at least, help to alleviate it or not make it worse. And because it took so long for her to get what she needed, that's when the financial ramifications that we were talking about came back into play, because she was having to attend more physio and, maybe take more medication, like do whatever, because of the pain that it was caused by simply not having the correct equipment to be able to do her job, equitably with everyone else. And what you mentioned about being an advocate, I think, is really powerful, because it's something that, in that situation, I tried really hard to do, as someone who's not really afraid to get in a fight. I would often, try and help with Chairgate as much as I possibly could. And I do think, the amount of guilt and anxiety, sometimes shame, and just all of that simply asking for what you need to do your job can bring, means that, the best thing that someone else can do is support and advocate as well. So yeah, what I'll do now is I'll move on to Shawnee next. So can you talk to us a little bit about any challenges that you may have faced in the workplace as a result of your illness or disabilities?
Yeah, so currently I work for Bonsai Collective as a community manager. I started in June of 2021. But before that, so Bonsai is my first full-time salaried job, because before I started at Bonsai, I was actually in academia. So I have an undergraduate degree in forensic science, and I went from that straight on to do my PhD in forensic chemistry. And academia, and especially in the hard sciences, is not accessible. They really struggled to make any changes to accommodate me when my chronic illness started getting so bad to the point that I couldn't stand up straight for periods of time more than 10 minutes. And it actually got so bad that I left the field after that. I was like, I don't want to work in this field anymore. I'm burnt out from everything that I've been putting myself and my body through for the past 4 years. So I ended up going into content creation full time, as well as doing branding for content creators, so emotes, logos, things like that. Until I ended up in Bonsai. I got very lucky with where I landed. So Bonsai is a fully remote studio. We don't have an office. Everyone works fully remote. We do all of our daily stand-up and syncs and things like that using video call on Discord, much like we're doing right now. And we're also have flexi time. So if I'm not having a great day, I can start later and then just flexi time anything I missed through the week. No questions asked. We're mental health and physical health first. So if I turn up to daily stand-up and I am very obviously unwell, I will be told to log off and go to bed. I landed in a very good place in terms of accessibility. Some of our leadership are chronically ill. Quite a lot of our team is chronically ill disabled. And because we have people who are chronically ill and disabled, they're the ones that are like leading the way for how the studio operates. Which I don't think you see a lot of places, because a lot of places are run by able-bodied people that don't think about extra hurdles that they don't have to jump over. So in terms of in the games industry, I've been very lucky to land at a studio where all of my needs are met and then some, which is kind of made it a really great experience, especially for deciding to change careers after doing something else for so long.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's really good to hear that they have been so supportive, and hopefully there are some learnings there that any employers who are watching now or who watch this later can take away with them. It is good to have people who understand, properly understand from having experienced it. But I think as well, it's important to not you shouldn't have to have a line manager, say, who's also chronically ill for you to be taken seriously. I think Rosie said something to that effect in chat as well, that that she had a manager in the past who didn't look beyond her own experience and couldn't comprehend adjustments for others because she personally didn't need them. And yeah, that's absolutely true. But I also really liked, Shawnee, that you mentioned that other people will advocate for you if you don't look well. That they will, enforce that you need to take time to look after yourself. Because I think that, that's something that comes up in conversation around mental ill health a lot as well, is that it can be really difficult to practice what you preach. It can be very easy to say to someone, you're clearly not doing okay, whether it is mentally or physically. You should take some time. But when you're in that position, it's always like, oh, well, it's okay if they do it, but it's not okay for me to do it. So I'm still gonna go to work even though I'm not doing well. So having someone who can advocate for you in that way is really positive, and I'm really glad that you, that you're in that position. Now, Paige, I'll ask the same question of you, and I also want to talk specifically about the thing you posted on Twitter recently, about your little office tour, because I think that would be a really cool thing to chat about.
Yeah, so I'll start with when I was younger, I didn't know I had ADHD. So when I was 18 and meant to be going to university, there was nothing I liked, there was nothing I loved, and I didn't see the point in paying a lot of money for not wanting to do anything. So I went straight into work instead. And this was a little bit before I was diagnosed with arthritis. So it was a little bit before I actually started getting any real symptoms that would cause me any trouble. So my first job was good. The second job I went into fired me because we didn't understand that I was chronically ill, and some of the accommodations they gave me, they then threw back in my face as a reason to fire me for being lazy, which was a problem. This place I went to after that, again, they tried to fire me for apparently not disclosing my illness, that I was only diagnosed with 2 months after starting that job. So there was no way I could have known anyway, because the job was manual lifting and I didn't know it was aggravating my illness to the point I needed a severe diagnosis very quickly. So they basically said to me, you can take this other job in another store or we can fire you. What do you want? And that job where I took the management because I had rent to pay, it was a manager trainer position, crippled my mental health to the point that I was suicidal for the first time. And my husband physically had to come with me to the store to hand in my resignation letter because I was terrified of the manager. These days, that manager wouldn't have lasted 2 minutes in a conversation with me. But back then, I was freaking terrified, sick, and not having any clue of how this worked. I would start work by cycling 3 miles to my business like at 5 in the morning, wait for someone to open, work until 2 p.m., then cycle home, sleep till 11, eat something, go to bed. And my husband didn't see me for like 6 months because that's all I could manage, not knowing that I was sick, and that's what was causing the majority of my issues. So from there, I ended up working in another shop where I started using mobility aids, and the managers were pretty chill about it. I was one of the only people that I was allowed to use a chair on the shop floor and like a walking stick. As long as I got shit done, they didn't really care. Fair enough. In retail, that was probably the best I could ask for, was just an understanding that I need this walking stick, and if you take it away from me, I'm going to hit you with it. And then I went into the games industry. Now, the games industry was a bit more chill. The manager I had was understanding. The issue I had was when I started becoming an ambulatory wheelchair user, we had gotten a new office. And this new office was beautiful and shining, and it had elevators, and it did have accessible, like little lifts up some of the staired areas. But what it had was fully manual doors, which were heavy and locked, and you had to use a scan card to get through each of the doors. And there was at least 3 to get into where my office, my desk space was. So in a wheelchair, I'd have to lean up to tap my card, then wait for it to click, wheel forward, grab the thing, pull it back, and often tip myself out of my chair to open that first door, move into the secondary lock, and do it all again. If I had to go to the bathroom, I had to do that back the other way, plus opening the manual doors to get to the bathroom, then get to the stores and do it all the way back. And it would often happen that I would get locked out of my office space because nobody would open the door for me. And when I questioned why the doors were made that way, when they very could have been tapped to like automatically open, their answer was they'd spoken to the one person in the company of like 400 people who used a wheelchair, and he said it was fine. That's not fine. It's not. This one person who was in a wheelchair had much more upper body strength and was able to manage the doors a lot more easily. I couldn't, so I often just got locked out of my office because I needed to go to the bathroom and couldn't physically get back through. And the thing that had landed me in the wheelchair for a while was I'd had an accident coming down a hill and had split both my knees open almost to the bone level, so I couldn't stand because they were stitched. So it was very much a, I have been abandoned until somebody finds me, or I phone my boss to ask him to open a door. So accessibility, you can try it, but you need to poll more than the one person that you think is disabled enough to have an opinion, because anyone with a chronic illness or an invisible illness wasn't approached. Nobody knew there'd been a disability poll apart from the one person who was visually disabled. So in working in an office, not good. Could have done a lot better. Tried, swing and a miss. Again, speak to multiple people. You can't just have one person be your voice, as Chat is saying. However, I now work for a charity called Special Effect, and as you can imagine, for a charity that works with disabled people, immunosuppressed people, young people, older people, people who have had severe like accidents and have been in like ICU with very like limited communication needs. My colleagues understand disability a lot more. Not a ton of them, as far as I am aware, are disabled, or they've not deigned to share that with me. That's completely their business. But it does mean that I joined during COVID and I worked completely remote. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, I signed my permanent contract as fully remote. I have no requirement to go into the office at all. I can if I want to, but it's 100 miles away, so it's a little difficult to get to. But I am included in all meetings via video call. There are board game nights. I get phoned in and somebody just holds up cards for me so I can play, which, I'd rather play myself, but I'd rather not die by getting COVID and going there. And my team are very understanding. I have always had, as you said, Lee, like a massive trauma around taking time off sick because I'm certain they're going to fire me again. And I've very much made that plain to my colleagues and my boss, being like, I don't feel safe taking time off sick, so I've booked it as holiday because then you can't fire me. To which my boss very recently has been like, shut up, stop that, remove that holiday, re-sign it as sick. I don't care. You've already done the work. And I'm like, oh, cool. Well, my hands are really painful and I shouldn't even be typing right now, so I'm going to bed. And they're like, cool, bye. It's so, I still feel scared and frightened quite a lot at my current job because I'm certain they're going to fire me at some point, but they're not. And I know that my colleagues are better than that and that they are understanding, to the point that Sky was saying yesterday. I got to try one of the coolest things for inclusion accessibility that I've ever tried. It's called a double three robot. If you can imagine what, I don't know if you've been to a fast food place that has those big screens that like you can order stuff on. It's a big rectangular screen on a stick with two wheels. It looks very silly, but it has a webcam and it has a speaker system and it's two-way. So it's essentially like a video call, but it is mobile and I control it like playing Age of Empires on PC. It's point and click. So yesterday, for 40 minutes, I was able to walk myself around our entire office space that I'd never been to, speak face to face with colleagues that I'd never seen in person before. Obviously, it's not in person, but it's the closest thing. And I was able to go up ramps, down ramps, outside, in other office spaces. I was able to turn and look at artwork on the walls. And I could do all of that without a single other person helping me get around the majority of the space, just over like lips on doors and things like that. And it works like a Roomba. So when I was done, park it back at the charging space, press the button, it docks itself, and that's it. It's incredible. I was able to do all that from my seat, 100 miles away, and speak to my colleagues. And they've said to me, if you want to use it for meetings, you can do. If you want to be more physically present, and it's like, holy shit, I've been fired for needing to sit on the floor before because I physically couldn't stand, and now my colleagues are making sure that I can be a robot and terrorize them in the office. That's so cool. And it means so much to me. It means when there's a Christmas party this year that I can't go to for my safety, I can still be present. And like with the robot as well, you can raise the height and lower it so I can look my colleagues in the eye instead of stare at them like through their own computer screens. It's so cool. And the tech is being used for other people around the world. Recently, Special Effects worked with a lady called Lucinda, who is physically disabled, to be able to visit a exhibit called the Futures Exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington from the UK. 3,000 miles, instantaneous connection, took herself around it using the robot.
That's awesome.
That is what the future for accessibility and inclusion should look like. And I know it scares some people who aren't a fan of robots and that kind of thing, but for the people that need it, holy cow, I've never felt so included in a space where people just sort of understood that I wanted to be present. I didn't want to be left out just because I needed accommodations. I don't want to be ignored, like you were saying, Lee. Like, I still want to be part of the world even if I can't be physically present in it.
Yeah.
And it's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm really glad that they were able to implement that. And it is like it should be the future, and it alleviates or supports with a lot of the issues that both Lee and the people in chat were mentioning about, all of the complex emotions that come with being left out of a physical office space. And just, I mean, people really should understand how this feels because the whole world spent 2 years locked inside. And, if you imagine that, but it's not over because it's not over. If everyone could go about their normal day and explore the world as a robot during COVID, I'm sure that they would have been a lot happier and probably felt a lot less isolated. So I'm really glad that you have that in place. And yeah, it seems like everyone in chat is giving a lot of love to special effect, which is all good. And that kind of segues us in really nicely to our next question, because it aligns really well with what special effect do. But from a personal experience perspective, I'm actually going to speak with Shawnee first. So can you tell us a little bit about, from like an end user perspective, when you are gaming, whether it's PC, console, whatever, are there any elements of that process that are difficult because of your chronic illness or disabilities? And if so, what kind of adjustments do you need to make when you are gaming as a sort of member of the community?
So many. If it is a game that has, let's take The Witcher 3 for an example. I love The Witcher 3. It's one of my favorite games, but I will get so distracted trying to follow a quest and getting distracted by another side quest just like popping up beside me and sending me an hour in the wrong direction because I don't have I have cognitive disabilities. I cannot concentrate enough to remember what I was trying to do before. But on top of that, I have issues with my hands. My hands, you know, I have a lot of pain with my hands, but I also have twitches, like muscle twitches that I can't control. So a good example for that is in the new The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2. They added a lot of accessibility features, which is what I would like to see in every game. But some of the ones that they added were things like ledge grab, and also the one that stops you falling off of ledges, which is a big one for me because if I'm trying to walk along like a small high up beam and my finger twitches and I fall off and I have to start that all over again, it's very frustrating. Those are the main ones that I use personally, along with things like subtitles, so that I can see what's going on as it's being said to me. Because I have, as part of like my ADHD, I have auditory processing disorder. So if there's multiple sounds going on, then whatever they've just said will often just be like a little garble of unintelligible words that make no sense. And I use absolutely anything that gets rid of motion sickness, motion blur, head bobbing, anything like that, because I also suffer from simulation sickness, which is essentially just motion sickness, but in video games. So I kind of use anything I can to get rid of that.
Yeah. Thank you. And so with the issue you mentioned with games like The Witcher 3, whereby it's very difficult to keep track of what you're supposed to be doing in the game, is there anything that game, for example, could implement that would help that? Or like, is there another game that has a lot of side quests that does it in such a way that it works for you?
I guess the main thing for me is good like signposting, and good like navigation. So something that will physically show me where I need to go, and like the direction that I need to go in at that time. So you think about if anyone's played Days Gone, that will usually have like an actual line on the minimap for you to follow. Or in things like Skyrim, where it's just a marker that's on the bar that you know when it's in the middle, you're going towards it.
Yeah.
Something that will actually show me what direction to go in. Because I will get lost very easily. And if there isn't something like that, I will spend an hour going in the wrong direction before I realize.
Yeah, and that's a very simple thing that can be implemented into the HUD UI that can also be toggled on and off. Like the minimap and quest markers in like Breath of the Wild, for example, you can get rid of all of that, or you can have everything on. So yeah, I think that if more games started doing that, and it's interesting that you raised that as well, because I think a lot of times when people think of accessibility in games, they think of like physical things, which are obviously important and also potentially more challenging to implement, maybe. But oftentimes, I think that people don't talk so much about, like the smaller pieces of accessibility. So thank you for raising that. So Paige, will you talk to us next about sort of any accommodations that you need to make when you're playing games, or any suggestions that you have that games could implement that would make it easier for you to play them?
I was just scribbling down notes while we were going there because there's quite a few that I need and quite a few that I perceive a need for. Um, so similar to Shawnee, I also have cognitive issues because of things like ADHD. But the medication I take really dampens my reflexes. So this is something we've perceptibly tested, my husband and I'll explain how in a minute. But I essentially get audio visual lag. So if you're watching a stream or a video and you notice that the audio and the video are slightly out of sync and it's a little weird, that's how my brain feels a lot of the time when I'm playing games. So I'll play Halo, I'll hear a grenade go off, and I'll shoot that way. Because my brain hasn't perceived quite how the space works. It's registered the sound after it's already happened, and then the reaction happens. Now, it looks like it happens fast, but it's really frustrating because as instantly my brain will go, that was the other way. You absolutely, what are you doing? Duh. That now you're dead. That would have been so easy to fix, but you messed it up. So any game that actually does help with showing where audio is coming from, so like having a flash on one side of the screen, or having like a triangle indicator, or like Halo does where it shows you a symbol of like a grenade somewhere on the screen to show you what side it's coming from, super handy. And a very good thing for people that may have low visibility as well as having color, having light, things that are sort of you're able to see. Most people who are blind are not usually completely without vision, so having things that are much easier or variable to see can really help with playing video games. The audio visual lag that I described, actually we did test with Halo Infinite. So if I play Infinite, because I like playing shooter games multiplayer, if I play it before I take any medication, it hurts, but oh my god, I am a dab hand with a sniper rifle. The second I take my medication, still okay. After 10 minutes, I cannot concentrate properly. I cannot find the thing I'm trying to shoot, and my KD goes down massively because suddenly there's this element of lag. So I've been shot before I even can figure out where somebody is. Whereas before the medication, it's very much what you'd expect for a regular see something, shoot it. It's really interesting and also very frustrating because I'm on medication pretty much from the minute I wake up till the minute I go to sleep. So there's a very slim window to be able to be any good at shooter games. So it's interesting. Hello, cat. It's interesting. Other things that I tend to need is controller support. There's very few games I play with mouse and keyboard. I have very small hands. And because of the arthritis, I have what's called calcification in my joints. So I can sort of show you, but you can see this finger bends that way, this one bends that way, this one bends. So they bend inwards on each other. And when they are swollen like they are now, I cannot remove this ring because this is all swelling around my joints. So if I try and play a keyboard where I have to keep stretching and flexing my fingers, it massively hurts and I can't play. A controller is a much more sort of comfortable shape to curl my fingers in on with the bowed angles, so I can play a lot longer and with a lot more comfort. So having controller support, having that be sort of config as well, so being able to change the buttons, make things a more comfortable setup is really handy. Things like journals and logs as well, like Mouse was saying. If I go back to a game and it doesn't tell me what I did last time, well, I won't be playing that again because I've got no bloody clue what happened yesterday. So that's not going to work. It's one of the reasons I don't play the old Pokemon games because they just kind of expect you to remember what you did, and I've got no clue. The newer ones do at least say, "Psst, go to that town." It's like, oh, okay, that's a start. I can go from there. Thank you. So anything that sort of supplements the slowdown in my cognitive faculties is very, very handy to me. And things that sort of help me manage that slowdown by showing me where things are or where I need to be is very handy. When it comes to physical things, because one of the things, like you mentioned, Sky, that's often forgotten is when it comes to accessibility, there needs to be both a software and a hardware level. For people that have, say, somebody that doesn't have arms, they're not going to be able to play a controller traditionally. You need to be able to put it onto control schemes that might work with feet or shoulders or head or lips. So you need to be able to rebind all of those controls separately. Not a ton of games do that, and so you can't play those games unless you're able to script something yourself or mod it, which again, if you're disabled and you just want to play a video game, you possibly don't know how to mod an entire control scheme into a video game. So things like that are really handy. Vibration control is something I often don't see games have, but I have carpal tunnel down both wrists because the swelling aggravates them. So if a game has vibration and it doesn't let me turn it off or like lower it down, I have to physically throw the controller anytime vibration starts, or my hands will cramp and stay like this, which, as you can imagine, is very uncomfortable. And then you can't continue playing. So that's a very small thing that most people don't even think about, that if it isn't there for me, I can't play. Some controls, some like actual physical controllers do have a toggle on them for vibrations. So you can turn off the physical vibration rotors. That's really handy. I love that. And that's physical sort of accessibility with hardware. That is really wonderful to see. I guess the only other thing as well that I would like to mention is things like mashable buttons. So Final Fantasy is in my slightly grumpy books recently because they didn't have any QTEs until I got into later content where you need to bash controls to not die instantly. So I lament the moment that comes up. There are a number of games that do it very well, but if you have a mash button or a quick time event that requires you to be quick on cognition or be able to sort of trigger this part of your wrist very quickly, if you want to test what it feels like, if you hold your palm up and twist your fingers, you're going to feel all of the different parts here move. And if those are sore, you ain't getting through that part of the game. So being able to have it be a hold instead, or just a tap or an unfailing one, like happens in Supermassive games, is really handy, because even if you bugger it up, as long as you tried, you're still going to pass that encounter. So yes, accessibility, I think the options that should be available for all are remapping, taking into account that both hardware and software needs to be looked at, and just give as many options as you can. If you have options in your dev environment for different lighting, see if you can make that a front end thing as well. Because even though you might think it ruins your gritty aesthetic, if somebody can't see your game, how are they going to play it anyway? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank you for bringing up the, I guess, like the difference in importance of looking at both software and hardware. And what you mentioned about the QuickTime events, Iliostomy Bag in chat, had a really good point on that as well. They said, when some people think about accessibility in games, they assume that means making the game super easy or on kid mode. And it's like, no, the game can still be challenging. I just don't want the QuickTime events to be hammering the same button hundreds of times in the space of 5 seconds because it ruins my hands. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And I really liked what you mentioned as well about just having options, because it's important to remember as well, like, not every sort of accessible feature that you implement is going to be needed by everyone who has different accessibility needs. Some of them will need multiple things. Some people will need, like, everyone's going to need a different combination of things, even maybe people who have the same condition. So adding as many options as you can means that people can, customize it to a point that it fits within their comfort and their ability to play the game. And then I guess something that you and Shawnee both mentioned about sort of sound elements in games and the importance of subtitles. One of the things I really like about Minecraft is it has directional subtitles. So it'll tell you where the sound is coming from. I always play that with subtitles on just because I get confused or like a bit overwhelmed when there's a lot of stuff happening, or like I'm caving and I can hear a lot of mobs around me. And I think that is really useful to just, have the subtitle and then an arrow pointing to where it's coming from. So Lee, can you talk to us a little bit about your experience with accessibility in playing games?
Yeah, so I will say, before I say anything else, I was having like a little trauma response to the Final Fantasy thing, because I have had exactly the same thing. And I remember when I first was playing, I first had a QT. It was like, oh, you push a button, and I'm mashing it, like, and I hurt my hand so bad. And then someone told me that you could push any button on your keyboard, And then I remember that the next time it happened, I just slammed my hand on the keyboard. And it worked. And then like my hand hurt, my keyboard. I was like, at what cost do I have to play a video game where I'm just smashing that keyboard just to get through a QTE? Like, it was the most ridiculous thing ever. And then people were like, oh, why are you missing the QTE? And I'm like, oh my God, why is your game designed like this? Like, this is so bad. And I'm just like actively avoiding those instances where I have to use QTE. And I think that in itself was just like, that is bad design. That's a really good example of bad accessibility. And I massively agree with that specifically. That was something I was going to bring up, was QTEs, anything with a mash. I get angry. I spy a game and I say, you got mashing in your game? No. If you don't have an option to let me hold a button down or skip it, preferably skip it. Because even holding a button down, I have problems with my hands. I do tend to use a controller. It depends on the game what I have more difficulty with. I might have difficulty with a controller depending on the style of the game. I might find keyboard and mouse easier. But I generally, my hands cramp up. And even holding a button, I can be like that. If I do that for way too long, I'm in pain. So having an option to just bypass those moments altogether is fantastic. And, you know, the option to hold is preferable if you don't want to do that. I don't understand why you would not want to do that, because you're not hurting anyone. Another thing for me, same as everyone else, is subtitles. I have to use subtitles. I can't hear my game if I don't have subtitles. Same with everything else. I also adore games that allow you to customize them, because I have difficulty looking at certain colors on other certain colors. So I tend to change mine to yellow if I'm allowed. And also that leads me into another massive adjustment that not a lot of games have, which is the ability to adjust the color of your HUD. Fallout was a really fantastic game for this, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, because it allowed you to change that HUD to whatever color worked for you. And it was fantastic, because I remember playing New Vegas and I think the default was like an orange color, but most of that game is an orange color. So I would change it to like a bright blue. And I was like, oh my God, I can actually see what I'm doing. You know, it's way better. And the thing is about stuff like that is that for people who have accessibility needs, that's helpful. For people who don't have accessibility needs, it's customization. So nobody loses out, because you get people who are like, I don't need this. I'll make my HUD pink and I feel fun and cute. And it's like, I'm so happy for you, because I can also use this and actually see my video game. You can use this and have fun with your video game. Nobody loses when you try and add an accessible feature to a game. And that also goes for like things like remapping buttons. Again, just echoing the point that others have made, you know, being able to remap your button, whether it's keyboard or mouse or controller, because a lot of games seem to say, yeah, you can remap your keyboard and mouse, but no, you can't remap your controller. And it's like, why? Why can I not do that? Because it can make such a difference. Some things that are intuitive for people might not be intuitive for other people. Jumping is something that we do all the time in a game. And generally, you know, we have jumping on a certain button. But if it hurts somebody to be pressing one position with their finger, being able to change that position that they're going to be frequently using, again, it doesn't hurt anyone, and all you're doing is helping someone. I'm a massive fan of being able to remap stuff. I've played a lot of fighting games, so I'm very used to that. And that's also another thing, is that in games like fighting games and some other games that sort of generally have combat, stuff that sort of involves making things easier. So for a fighting game, generally we know that you have to do a combo to do stuff, but there are certain fighting games that have like combo assist, which means that you don't have to press every single button, or it will make it easier for you when you're doing certain roll-offs and stuff like that. It's little details that can make it actually accessible to people. I can't play fighting games for very long, probably about 15-20 minutes at most, which isn't actually too bad because that's a few games with a friend. But I don't think I'd be able to play them at all if I was having to press way more buttons or having to stretch around a controller. So having those like options to put assist in is fantastic. Another thing that I think is quite important and not put in a lot, and there's only one game, I don't know if there is only one game that does it, but only one game that I can think of that does it, which is The Quarry. is going back to subtitles. But if I remember rightly, the Quarry had an open dyslexic font on it that you could use, and it made it more helpful for people with dyslexia. That is something I'd never seen before, and it's fantastic. I'm not dyslexic myself, but my mother is, and she's not going to play the Quarry, but there are games out there that because my mum is a gamer, there are games out there that she will play, and the idea that I could potentially introduce my mum to a game, be like, you can read this and not have as much difficulty, that would be amazing. But games just don't implement that. But actually seeing a game do that was so like changing for me. I was like, whoa, that's really cool. And then I think when you have a game that sort of goes, here's an accessibility option that you've never seen before, I sit there and I just go, that's great. And then I look at all my games and I go, why aren't you doing this? You know, like, what's your excuse? Because this game can do it, and it's not changed anything. It's not made it a worse game. It's made it better, if anything. And it sort of makes you question, okay, well, what is the excuse? Why aren't people doing that? I think a really, really good example, actually, is Celeste. I remember Celeste having an assist mode. And if I'm remembering rightly, it was like nuts. Like, you could do all sorts of it. You could make the game slower. You could make it have like more stamina. You could skip chapters. It gave you an awful lot of customization of how your game experience is. And I think this also goes back to the idea of just giving people options. You know, you're not limiting people from playing your game if they have options, you know, and you're not ruining the game by giving people options. I think the only time that there's, and it's not an argument, but the only time people have an argument is when it's an online game. And even then, the argument is always people are going to exploit it. And I just think, let them exploit it, because we deserve to play games too. Like, who cares if somebody is using, I don't know, like a color blindness thing to just get a slightly better view when they're shooting. I don't care. I want to let all these other people who don't have that option play the game, because I don't really think on a large scale it's going to ruin it. All you're going to do is make the game more accessible. And just, yeah, like I said before, I don't think you lose out on adding options to things. And everybody needs something different. And the more options you give to people, the better your game's going to be. Your game doesn't get worse by adding accessibility into it. And that's something that I think a lot of people need to realize.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And you're absolutely right. And what you mentioned about the like the customization in Celeste is a really good point, because, you know, if you don't use it, then so what? But a lot of people are going to use it, and it's not just going to be people with accessibility needs. It could be people who, you know, just want to play the game differently, or who who aren't very familiar with games and want to be able to try something without it being, you know, overwhelming, having to learn a lot of new things. It opens up the game not only to people who are disabled, but also potentially just people who aren't really gamers, which is expanding your audience and probably going to sell you more games. And it's like you said, I really don't see how there is a downside to this, and it should just be done by everyone all the time. And just Callie in chat said that the dyslexia font options would really help them a lot, because they don't have dyslexia, but it would help them with Erlen syndrome. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I haven't heard of it before. But that's another example of how, like, a lot of people see options as like, oh, like different color options is for people who are colorblind. And I'm like, well, no, it's not. It can be for people who have sensory issues. It can be for people who are autistic. It can be, you know, for X, Y, Z. And the same with the text. It's not just for people who are dyslexic. It can make the game more accessible for a whole range of people for a whole number of reasons. And so, yeah, the keyword to take away there is just give us options. So I guess the next question I have is quite a big one, because we've talked so far about things in the workplace and and the games industry as workplaces specifically. We've also talked about being an end user and being a gamer, and those two things combined kind of give us what is the game industry right now. So my next question, which I will be asking to Paige first, is how do you feel the industry is doing for accessibility at the moment? In that broader sense, like, do you think that there are positive changes happening? Are there enough of them? If so, what's going well? Or do you think that there's still a lot that needs to be done?
I think it's a bit of both, but not in a negative way. So if we think back literally like 10 odd years, you had the Xbox 360, which had a lot less processing power. But there were some very basic accessibility things in there for the games. But going back a bit further than that, there wasn't really anything because there wasn't really awareness and there wasn't really the processing power to be able to run extra things or the file size to be able to have extra control schemes and stuff like that. So I do think that if we look at games and the amount of games recently that we're starting to see have more information publicly about accessibility or that are talking about the things that they've been able to do or what they'd like to do with their game, some games even going back to their titles and adding in extra accessibility because they've been able to put the time and the money to work on it, then I think that's great, and it's happening a lot more. I mean, recently, we just had God of War Ragnarok. No spoilers, I've not been able to play it yet. But that made a big deal out of all its accessibility measures. And when on launch day one of them wasn't working correctly, I believe a patch went out to make it work, which is excellent. I know some people have been a little reticent about the most recent Last of Us because it's like the second or third remake of the game. But it did come with a lot of from the ground up changes, which is really cool because they went back and saw where it fell down initially and how they could make it better. Warframe, which is this really great online free-to-play game where you play a space ninja and you wear different suits and fight with various different weapons across the world, went back to its game again recently with a recent update and added in more accessibility for some of the new features, which again, that game's been out probably coming up to a decade or sort of within like sort of 5 to 10 years old. So they don't have to go back to it and add more, but they did. And that's awesome. I think that is growing and there is a lot more people talking about it. There are a lot more advocates. There are a lot more disabled people through platforms like Twitch and YouTube and TikTok publicly saying, I want to give you cash, but you need to give me the ability to do so. Which, accessibility is a good business endeavor. More people buy your games if they can play them. So it's something I think that's getting better. There's still people that don't necessarily understand it. There is still this understanding in communities often, like what chat was saying, that accessibility is cheating or that accessibility is making a game easier. But as somebody who's been a gamer for almost all of her life, it's a game and it's a gaming achievement, and that might mean a lot to you. But just because somebody else gets to be good at a game doesn't mean it detracts from your experience. It doesn't make you less of a gamer, and nor does it make the experience of playing said video game cheap. Just because somebody else can do a headshot doesn't mean you can't do a headshot and that yours isn't really good, like somebody else used accessibility. So the issue comes when people tend to equate how good you are of a person with how much you can play a video game. And that's where I think the communities and sort of the games industry could do a bit more is in, I love seeing Xbox often putting out things about accessibility, and then when anyone goes, oh, but it's cheating, they're like, no, bye. Like when you have a community management team or you have people who speak publicly about your games, back up the community. I love to see it when it happens, but do it more. If your community's being toxic or just misunderstanding and have concerns, they might come from a good place. Just alleviate them and talk with them and explain why you did the things you did, because your company's paid to have accessibility measures put in, so make sure people understand it was a worthy purchase. Because as chat was saying earlier, when you don't experience something, you may not necessarily consider that others need it to be able to have an experience like you do. And so for those people that don't understand, you have to make them understand, and often just by sharing information, that's going to work. But if not, you just have to tell them to get on with it, unfortunately. So that's some of the areas I think that they could improve on. But I do think the industry as a whole is growing, is changing. From things like COVID, we saw a lot more virtual events, which is really great. I'm going to be very sad if they keep dwindling down, because actually being able to, get a virtual ticket to a con or to, like a reveal of a new game, to do that from the safety of your own home, especially if it's in another country, is really cool. And again, if it comes down to cash, people pay for virtual tickets. It is accessibility in itself, and you get more people aware of your products. And if it's a marketing thing, you want people to be aware, especially when disabled people spend so much bloody time online. You probably want them to make them aware quite quickly because they'll talk for you. It's things like that where everyone had to learn to get on like they were disabled because of COVID. People didn't like it, and now they've gone, oh, thank God that's over, but forgotten all the people that still live like that. So that's another area. I think the only other thing, I don't want to make this negative, I'm not going to mention the game name, but don't use disabled people as a crutch in your video game. It's very light on positive disability representation in games. We have a few characters who are autistic, which is fantastic. And yes, depending who you are, autism or ADHD, you could designate that as a disability for yourself. Not everyone will, but you do have people like that. You do have people like Joker in Mass Effect who has brittle bones. But there are some games, including one I played recently, where there was a quest where the quest giver said to you, I'm a business owner and one of my workers is really sick and disabled, essentially, and we've not been able to make these deliveries. Can you help us out? And I was like, oh, fuck yeah, of course I can help you out. Like, let's, the disabled person that you're helping out, brilliant. I went round town, made all these excuses, gave everyone their items, came back, and the quest giver said to me, oh, thank you for doing that. He's actually just lazy and like sleeping in, and I didn't want them to be annoyed at me. And I logged out immediately and put the game down, and I was just heartbroken by it, because this is a game that had been really cool with everything up to that point, and then they added in a quest where you were meant to be helping somebody who's disabled, but instead you were covering up for somebody thinking that their colleague was lazy, and making everybody in this video game, all these NPCs believe that they were helping somebody when in fact they were covering up for ineptitude, which is how we often get perceived. That's not good enough. So for all the good things that can be done, you still need to figure out how you're representing people and how you're actually giving them some positive rep.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add because you raised so many really valid points. So yeah, thank you. Lee, would you like to tell us a little bit about sort of how you feel about the big question of accessibility in the industry?
Yeah, short answer, we're not doing enough. I think, yeah, it's safe to say, you look at older games, there was no accessibility, not really. And you look at games today, and yeah, we've made tremendous steps, but there's so much room for improvement. We still don't have a general standard for accessibility across games, which is incredibly frustrating. You cannot go pick up, say, 4 games that have just come out and have the same accessibility options in all of them, like as a standard. I recently played a game that didn't have subtitles, and I was like, it's 2022, how does your game not have subtitles? And it was a recent game. So I think that that's something that desperately needs to be sorted, that we need to have a sort of standard that's like, you cannot publish your game without accessibility options. You should not be able to put a game out without subtitles, without the bare minimum to make it accessible for people. And there's definitely a lot more we can do. I do think there are some really good things that are done in games. And I will say that, I think a massive part of it is communities. I wanted to shout out the website Can I Play That, because that's a massive help, I think, for a lot of disabled gamers, because you just go on there, there's reviews, there's menu breakdowns, there's generally enough information on there for you to sort of input a game that's come out and be like, hey, can I play Animal Crossing New Horizons? Is this going to be a game that I can access? And, they will have people who have taken a look and said, right, well, this game might be accessible for, some people, but it's not accessible for deaf people. It's not accessible if you have eyesight issues. And I think it's an incredible resource. But again, it's like, that's fantastic community-led effort. We love to see it. But then in itself, games need to be making more of an effort to actually give that information out. It's like when we were saying about God of War. Fantastic that they've actively been pushing, hey, we've done all of this. And I love to see that, because I'm like, yes, tell us what you're doing. Tell us all the things that you've put into your game, because we need the actual developers to tell us what they've put in, rather than people having to scramble around, spending their time going, oh my God, can other people play this? Because it's like, there's people who are spending their time having to break down these games for other people because game devs are not taking into account. It's not just game devs, I just mean companies, they're not taking the time to actually just say, yeah, by the way, you can play our game. We do have X, Y, and Z. But generally, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag still. Like, we are doing an awful lot, but there's so much more we can be doing. And I will say that a big sticking point for me, just going on to that last point that was brought up, was about representation. I'm very fierce about representation of anybody in games for multiple reasons. I hadn't actually mentioned it so far, but I am autistic, if you couldn't guess. But that's something that's like, the autism disabilities, both visual and non-visual, representation in games does not do us justice as people. And my issue with that is that I was really heartbroken to hear about that, like that quest, because that was horrible. And I was like, oh my God, no, why are we making games like this? But the biggest thing for me is that I think that we need to put disabled people with conditions in video games across the board. We don't just need them to be good people. We need heroes who are disabled, but we need villains who are disabled. We need every single person to have something. I'm not saying every single person has to be in a game has to be disabled, but also why not? Like, doesn't make a difference either way. But my issue is that sometimes you have people who think that your representation of a person has to be the good guy for it to be positive representation, and that's not true. The issue is making that representation about them being disabled, or if you have a villain who's disabled and they're like, I'm disabled because I'm sorry, I'm a bad person because I'm disabled, that's bad representation. But if you have a villain who's just a villain, who has their goal or whatever reason for being a villain, and they're also disabled, that's just who they are, that is better representation. They're not a bad representation because they're a potential bad guy. They're good representation because they're showing that people are multifaceted, that we are 3D. I mean, we are humans. We can be nice people. We can also be arseholes. Like, I want to see video games that represent us as we are. Just because I have a disability doesn't mean that I don't have the capacity to be nasty. It also doesn't mean I don't have the capacity to be a good person. And I think that, generally speaking, a lot of people are afraid to tackle that because they think they're going to get it wrong. And I'm very much like, you just need to sort of talk to people. You need to do your research, but it's not impossible to have representation for disabled people with chronic. You can have chronic illness in your games. You can have physical disabilities. You can have unseen disabilities. You could put everything in your game. I mean, bloody hell, we have wizards and witches and all sorts in video games. Why is it so far-fetched to have a character who uses a wheelchair, or even, uses a mobility aid, or has autism? It's not impossible. I think a game that I've really enjoyed this is a very long time ago, was We Happy Few, because that had an autistic character in it. And I remember reading that I think it was one of the devs had an autistic daughter, and that they had sort of based that character around that. So they had a lived experience. And I felt like, it wasn't 100%, but it was a good representation of a character. And I think that that's sort of basically where people need to sort of start steering themselves. You don't have to know somebody with the condition, but, there's consultancies out there. There's people like us. You know, you can come talk to people, you can reach out to people and just get the information you need to make characters like that. Because again, you know, just to follow on to that point of like, you know, disabled people need to be able to play your games. Disabled people will play your game if there are disabled people in that game with good representation. I will play a game if I see a character and I can go, they're like me. You know, I'm like grabbing them and I'm like, oh my God, they're just like me. I love this character. I will play that game over and over and over. And I will scream about it because there's somebody there that's like me. And I think that's something that we just could do a lot more of, is having better representation. And it doesn't have to be good characters and not bad characters in terms of good and evil or in between. It just needs to be good representation.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, the representation point that you brought up is such a huge one. And I have not really had anything to do with We Happy Few, but I'm really glad to hear that there is some, you know, positive examples of representation in that, because it is difficult. Like, we've had a few examples, like someone in chat, it was Paige, said Halo. Paige also mentioned Mass Effect, which we featured at SAFE recently. But while you can have a handful of examples, it's not that easy to come up with games that actually represent disability, and especially physical disability, in like a positive way. Because as you were saying, Lee, like a lot of times when you see physically disabled people, they are the villain, and they are the villain because of what happened to them. And that's not a healthy way to look at it. And it even feeds into that mindset that we were talking about at the beginning of the panel, where people oftentimes maybe think that disability is something to be pitied or looked down on in that respect, which, you know, it's not. And the point you made about how, yes, disabled people can be bad people as well, but it's not because they're disabled. Like, that's a really good point. Okay, Shawnee, would you like to round us out on this question with your thoughts on how the industry is doing in general for accessibility?
Yeah, so to start with, I do want to add to the representation thing, because as soon as we started talking about it, and I'm gonna harp on about it again because it's one of my favorite games, but Days Gone, I think handles it quite well, in that you have two main characters who start out as able-bodied characters. One of them is disabled. One of them has severe PTSD, which you learn about as the story goes on. But the other one becomes physically disabled, like quite early on in the game. And I really like the story of this character, because it shows, or at least for me, it showed it in a way that I related to. Because when I first started getting more, like when I started getting more ill because of my chronic illnesses, because of my disabilities, and I stopped being able to do things, and I had that grief for the things that I could no longer do. And I feel like as you kind of go through the story of this character coming to terms with having a new disability in the midst of an apocalypse, I think it shows it really well. And I think it's the kind of thing that I would like to see represented more, is disability as a whole, and not just the positives and not just the negatives, but the whole picture.
Yeah.
And, you know, in terms of accessibility, I think there's been a lot of great strides in accessibility over the past few years, you know, with The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, with God of War. And I think that's fantastic. And I think that should keep happening. But what I would really love to see, and what it has not yet happened, is those accessibility options being made accessible to smaller studios. Because not every studio is going to have the budget to implement the accessibility options that are in God of War or The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, because that's a lot of manpower that goes into that. I can speak for Bonsai. We have a core team of about 15 full-time employees. Like, we do not have enough people to do all of those options, and we will put in as many accessibility options as we can in our game, but we're limited by what we can do because we're a new studio, we're a small studio. We don't have the backing of like Sony, as the example with obviously with Naughty Dog and with Sony Santa Monica with God of War. We don't have that big backing, and I really would like to see accessibility options being made accessible to all game devs. Having that standard that, these are things that everyone should be implementing, but also here's how to implement them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where like the more common it becomes, the cheaper and easier it will become, because that's just how technology works. So the onus in some respects is on the bigger companies to take that step because they can afford it now. And the fact that they can afford it now means that smaller companies can afford it soon. But you're right. I think it is important to consider that the accessibility features need to be achievable for smaller companies. So thank you so much for raising that. As we're approaching 4 now, and we've pretty much reached the end of what we planned to say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give all of the opportunity to just shout out anything that you're working on. It can be work related, it can be related to your personal endeavors. So we will start with Lee. Have you got anything that you would like to plug or let people know where they can find you?
You can find me on Twitter. It's at Wired Usagi, and also on Twitch under the same name, and also on Tumblr under the same name. I have stuff in the works, but it's all very secretive. So you just have to trust me, follow me, and there'll be some stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Thank you. Paige, now's your opportunity. Plug your stuff. Oh, I think you're muted.
On this microphone. On Twitch, you'll find me as Pandemonium. I've been in the chat, and on Twitter, you'll find me as Paige HRV. I am setting up some other platforms, so you'll see those listed on Twitter as they get set up. I guess the one thing I want to plug is that in January, I'm going to be running what's called the Through Our Eyes stream, which is a massive panel, probably about 30 guests, where we're going to be talking about trans rights, essentially, and LGBTQIA plus representation, and how other countries live and what troubles people have. So that's currently in the planning stages, but I will be putting out feelers to look for guests for that in the next sort of month or so. With I would like to ensure that we have good rep from all different backgrounds, all different sort of groups, different communities. So I'm going to be reaching out to some sort of specific groups to try and make sure that we have proper rep, proper diversity, and that it's not just a bunch of people who look like me talking about things only people like me know about, because that's not fair. So that's one of the main things. The other thing I just want to say is that if you've been watching this and you've been enjoying what people have been saying, just be a good advocate, and that can be so many ways. You can advocate for yourself with a doctor. You can advocate for a gaming community by telling some toxic idiot person on the internet to stop being so toxic and to give some good advice. You can advocate for communities. If you see something, say something. It's just, if you have a voice that you can use and somebody else can't use theirs, be the voice for them.
Thank you. And Shawnee, what are you working on? What are you got going on? Where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter as Mouse is Taken. You can find me on Twitch, TikTok, and pretty much any other platform as Mouse Was Taken. You could also find me on Twitter at Bonsai Games, all one word, and wishlist Luna Abyss on Steam because I am working on my first game that I will be credited in, and I am also part of the team that is working on accessibility for it. So,
Hell yeah. That's
join
awesome.
us.
That's awesome. And we will link all of these bits in the description of the YouTube video once it's uploaded. And then finally, you can find more about the charity Safe in Our World at Safe in Our World on all the social medias. And you can also find our website where there's a lot of really useful signposting for issues around mental health, mental ill health at safeinourworld.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. The chat has been really wonderful. There have been so many really good insights here, and I'm really glad that we were able to, provide a little bit of camaraderie, a bit of support for those of you who've joined us for the live stream today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.